Sal, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you. First, a couple of things I want to highlight, and that is uh, part of my world of doing research and analysis was to try to look at the root causes of conflicts, international conflict, criminal events, that kind of thing, but to really look deep for root causes as opposed to just wanting to solve the problem of the moment. Because when you're solving the problem of the moment, all you're doing is dealing with a symptom, not the disease. For example, there's a lot of discussion about NFL coach, black guy, not getting consideration for a job that he should have been considered for, and that kind of thing. And there's a lot of discussion. Well, we should do this. We should go to this rule, that rule. Understand what we're talking about is a symptom. There's a much bigger disease about racial animus and greed that we need to contemplate, as opposed to just that one micro event. And mind you, as I said from the beginning, my view is that racism is but a tool for the greedy. Racism in itself is not the problem. Greed is the problem. The fact that the greedy can use a mechanism like race to drive wedges, keep people fighting against each other, and distraction from what they're doing is really what we need to recognize, I think. It's part of what we're talking about in the next segment of classes: the Atlantic slave trade, the plantation business model, the European invasion of the Americas, and the doctrine of discovery is really aimed at looking at the broader picture so we can try to discern what the disease is. I also want to say that what I'm presenting is not my original research. It is the research of historians, academicians who have invested many years dealing with original documents and then producing their works that I have consumed, and I'm simply piecing them together into a broad picture where they might focus on a topic. I try to take it and rise it up to the higher level so we can kind of discern patterns and that sort of thing. However, for those historians who do dig deep into a topic, it's important to understand that when they look at something like slavery, it's extremely difficult, because in that research, you are looking into the abyss. You're looking into the darkest heart of human beings as to what they are capable of doing. I have in the past tried a little technique with the class to say, if I have $500 million, what would you do to get my $500 million? And we would, kind of play through, would you be willing to do this? Would you be willing to do that? Understand, there are people for whom there are no boundaries. There's no limit. There's no, something is too outrageous so that they can accumulate more and ever greater wealth and power. And it's important to recognize that. It's not everyone, but for those that do exist like that, they can make the existence for humans a horror. And so I'm going to be talking about different models. I talked about the human existence model from when we first emerged as a species, and that how the human existence model changed when we discovered agriculture and animal husbandry being a model for taking a living organism and having it perform work for you, having it pull a plow, having it move goods across the land. It is taking this living organism and harnessing its power to perform work. And that model is going to play out as we look at slavery. And so I want to begin by emphasizing about the Atlantic slave trade, that there is a difference between the African slave trade and the Atlantic slave trade. Slavery existed in Africa long before the Atlantic slave trade. It emerges in Africa, as we had talked about, through the cradle of civilization and agriculture taking root, and those who develop excess, that trade becomes wealth. And when they have starving neighbors and they don't want to share their food, they then recognize that they have power. And so, it's important to understand that it is here where warfare begins and slavery begins. So we had the Akkadian Empire about 4,500 years ago that reached into the lands that we now relate to as the African continent. And it set the example for excess wealth and power. And here is where the cradle of civilization was, and the Akkadian Empire emerges around it. And then what we had is Iraq had vast salt mines. And as society grew, mind you, we are talking about thousands of years that have transpired. But as societies become more complex, empires have grown, they begin trading with each other. They find that you can preserve meat by using salt, and salt becomes a commodity that is in demand in the world market. And so you have Muslim traders are moving salt from Iraq to the west of Africa, across the desert, and they're trading for gold that's mined in the west. As time goes on and these operations become more expansive, then there's a recognition that labor is needed in different parts of Africa. So these people who have engaged in warfare and they become the vanquished, the people who lost the war, they become slaves, a source of slaves. And what we have that gets introduced in Africa is the uprooting of slaves from their homelands and their families and their culture and their roots, getting uprooted from that and moved to another location far away. So that model, the uprooting of people and moving them to where their labor is needed, ripping them from their families, that model develops within the continent of Africa. And they're traded for mining operations and moved around east and west. It becomes a very sophisticated movement of slaves, enslaved people within the continent. It's European traders from Spain and Portugal who are trading along the African coast in the 15th century, when African emperors start to ask, what else would you trade for? We want more European goods. What else would you trade for other than gold and those sorts of things that were common for the Europeans to trade? And so they then say, well, what about slaves? And the slavery had been in decline from around the 11th century, but it has a resurgence come the 15th century. And that resurgence is as a result of the trade along the western coast of Africa. And so I want to take a look. I have some videos that I want to show you. Screen sharing has stopped, okay. And some of this is from a documentary that is the, let me just get this right. A documentary that is the Slavery Routes. And this is in 3 parts. All 3 were available on YouTube, but then they were taken down because of a copyright dispute. And now we have one source through Vimeo where I can get excerpts from the first part. So I want to share, this is titled Slavery Routes. It's from a project that was initiated by UNESCO several years ago and gives a very interesting take on slavery in Africa.
This is the story of a world whose borders and territories were drawn by the slave trade, where violence, subjugation, and profit imposed their own roots. Slavery did not begin in the cotton fields of the U.S. It is a far more ancient tragedy that has been going on since the dawn of humanity. From the 8th century onwards, for over 1,000 years, Africa was the epicenter of a global form of human trafficking.
My parents were abused by those with a fair complexion.
Nubian, Bambara, Songhai, Fulani, Ashanti, Yoruba, Madinka, Bantu, Igbo, Susu, Malinka. Over 20 million Africans were deported, traded, and reduced to slavery. This criminal system shaped our history and our world. So expansive was its reach that for a long time it seemed impossible to fully explain its mechanisms. In this series, we will journey back along the roots of the slave trade.
The thing about the slave trade, the key thing about the slave trade, and I always would have to explain this to American students who immediately would want to put it into a kind of an ethical, human rights kind of a context. You have to look at it in economic terms. And so if you're talking about a slave trade, you have to say, where's the demand? Where is there a demand for labor? And what is the nature of that demand for labor?
2,000 years ago, slavery became an integral feature of the Roman Empire. Eventually, in 476, Rome collapsed under the pressure of invasions by so-called barbarians. On scattered territories, a range of peoples and powers fought over the empire's remains. Visigoths and Ostrogoths in the west, Slavs in the northeast, Berbers in the south, the Byzantine Empire, the Kingdom of Nubia, and Arab tribes in the east. Just like Rome before them, these societies also practiced slavery.
In every society, we see slavery. And it doesn't matter where they come from. They come from everywhere from the steppes of Central Asia to Russia, to all of Eastern Europe, all through the Slavic countries, which is where, of course, the word for slave in most of the European languages comes from. It comes from the word Slav. And those were people that, in some conceptions, were enslavable.
For a long time, most slaves were white. The majority of slaves being black is a relatively recent phenomenon in history.
So how did a widespread practice evolve into an enormous trade which progressively focused its sights on the African continent? One of the starting points of this story is Cairo on the River Nile, a 23 million strong megalopolis born from the network of trade routes between the Middle East and Africa. Today, it's the continent's most important crossroads for people and goods. South of the modern city are the ruins of Fustat, the first Arab city in Egypt. These remains are a neglected site, and yet this is where the destinies of Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean converged some 1,400 years ago. In 641, a game-changing event would occur. With their vast conquest campaign underway, the Arab armies established a junction between Africa and the Middle East. Their expansion into Egypt would change the continent's entire economy and intensify the demand for slaves.
Slavery was crucial to the conquest itself, and it was crucial to the sustenance of the Islamic Empire and its expansion. From the conquest itself, captives were turned into slaves, and those slaves were recruited in the army that conquered, basically, the world at that time.
C'est avant tout, justement, un commerce.
It was first and foremost a trade with economic and political stakes.
C'est-à-dire que les
Slaves were the essential source of energy. Back then, there was no oil.
Pas de pétrole.
They were, in effect, the driving force behind these emerging empires.
De ces empires qui se mettaient en place.
The Arab troops pressed ahead as far as the south of Egypt. All along the Nile stretched the Christian lands of Nubia. There, Arabs found provisions and, above all, slaves, who they would enlist in their armies to pursue their expansion. In 769, they signed a pact with the Nubians, stipulating that hostilities would cease in exchange for 360 slaves per year.
In war, enslavement was considered a natural, a logical thing to do with prisoners. And without doubt, warfare was the major cause of enslavement. And almost everybody who was enslaved enslaved through an act of violence that was related either to war or to kidnapping or to very conscious slave raiding, which was an extension of war, in fact.
Donc, au départ,
In the beginning, it wasn't a trade.
on ne pouvait pas parler de traite,
It was spoils of war.
de guerre.
The conquest was swift. In less than a century, the Arabs had occupied the Mediterranean's southern shore. A border was taking shape, separating the Muslim world from the land of the so-called infidels. From the Kawar Valley in Niger to Makuria in the east and the Fezzan Desert region, the Arabs imposed the same conditions they had established in Nubia. They used these agreements to organize the first deportations from Africa to the Middle East. Entire convoys of captives made their way towards the world's new center, Baghdad. The illustrated Makama manuscripts, short tales taken from Arabic literature, show how these first African slaves intermingled with Muslim society. After 2 centuries of military conquest, the demand for slaves evolved. In the 9th century, the Abbasid dynasty embarked on a monumental project to transform the swamps around Basra into lush orchards. Instead of soldiers, Baghdad now needed workers to cultivate the Iraqi soil. To do so, the empire brought in thousands of slaves.
And along with this, there were I want to reemphasize the movement of people from their homelands to other places. Prior to this time, if you were a slave, there was a path to citizenship. There were rules that were set by religions on what you could and could not do to slaves. But as we enter into this phase, those rules start to get broken. We come to the Black Plague, in which it really fractures. This is before the Black Plague. But what's happening is this is human. I want you to think, I mentioned animals were used for work, becomes a machine. And what we see happen here, in my view, is humans become the machine, become the machinery. And so it becomes a human machine model.
2, the desert's last stop and the gateway to the Mali Empire. Heading this immense empire was Sinjata Keita, King of Kings, and its founding father. Victory in the Great Battle of Kirina in 1235 enabled him to unite all of the region's peoples and form a massive commercial network along the banks of the Niger. Arabs and Berbers established a trading post in Timbuktu, from where they maintained trade relations with this centralized empire. They bartered salt, fabric, jewelry, and Mediterranean dates in return for ivory, copper, slaves, and most importantly, gold.
Sundiata reorganized trade and tried to build up interregional relations in order to protect his empire's interests. So organizing regional and interregional trade was one of his greatest accomplishments, and may even have provided the foundations for the Mali Empire.
Timbuktu's importance stemmed from its geographical location. On the banks of the Niger River, its port became a center for transferring luggage and goods to and from the north. This natural crossroads occupied a strategic position in the trans-Saharan trade. The Mali Empire, which the Berbers traded with, enjoyed abundant wealth. Thanks to the Bambouk and Bouré mines, it possessed the world's largest gold reserves. More than half of the precious metal circulating in the Mediterranean originated from these deposits.
Throughout the history of the trade between North and South, through the Sahara, slaves were always there. And gold was always, sought after. One feeds the other.
Gold mining in African societies was mainly done by captives. The gold trade and slavery were closely linked. While I believe that gold may have predated slavery, the chronology isn't clear. It's usually said that both grew in significance at the same time. Slavery was in fact hidden behind the gold trade.
Some of Sundiata Keita's generals never gave up this lucrative business. But the fact is, Sundiata did make a number of efforts to intervene. He reminded his fellow countrymen of the threat that slavery posed to the survival of the Malinka country. Comparisons are questionable, but I do remember that Charlemagne himself prohibited slavery. But that didn't stop it. Men will be men.
Oral tradition credits Sundiata Keita as the founder of Malian identity and the symbol of the country's prosperity. For a century, the Mali Empire reigned over all of Western Africa, leaving behind the desert's greatest library. In Timbuktu, history inhabits the homes where over 360,000 medieval manuscripts are preserved. These treasures are owned by wealthy local families. They pass them down from generation to generation, often hiding them from view in secret places. Threatened with destruction, tens of thousands of manuscripts are now being restored. This 11th century Quran reveals how Islam spread throughout Western Africa. Thanks to merchant contacts between Arab Berbers and African elites, Muslim culture gradually spread among inhabitants of the Sahel region, south of the Sahara, to the point where Sundiata Keita declared Islam to be the official religion of the Mali Empire.
So they are now part of the Islamic Ummah, Islamic nation, and they can benefit from the Islamic empire, which is access to that big market that was controlled by the Islamic empire. And so this connection benefited both the Malians as well as the people in the Islamic community at large.
The conversion of people in the Sahel region prompted merchants and chieftains to seize slaves even further away. The slave trade expanded south of the Mali Empire to animist populations, who the Arab geographer Al Dimashqi relegated to the fringes of humanity.
Almost all Arab writers, since al-Bakri and al-Idrisi and the others, speak of lamnam. It's often dam-dam, sometimes myam-myam. They don't really see them as humans. They consider them to be cannibals outside of the civilized world. So the lamnam are the lowest black men, and practically not human. These descriptions show that reducing them to slavery was not really a problem from a theological or moral point of view.
To turn an individual into a slave, an important element is to portray them as an other, to construct an otherness. And human societies have a broad range of criteria for doing that. You can use the difference in skin complexion, difference in religion. In the trans-Saharan trade, both were combined.
I hope you're catching, that's a very important point, which is that racialization has its roots in the African slave trade before the Atlantic slave trade, the African slave trade. Now, I have to emphasize, people will often hear my lecture about that and say, you know, you're blaming Black people for being enslaved. I'm not blaming anybody for anything. I'm saying this is what happened. This is what's documented by really some of the most important works are done by African scholars. The UNESCO has funded an enormous study of African history with African scholars, and I mean, it's like a multi-volume available that you can go and read. It's a lot more detail than most people can handle, but it's very well documented. And so it is just to say that this tool for rationalizing and justifying inhuman behavior is just that. It's not founded on anything other than, I don't want you to hate me because I'm a brute and I'm the king or I'm the emperor. I'm the person getting wealthy out of this horrible thing that we call slavery. So it's important to recognize that. And it's important to know that more people died in the African slave trade than died in the Atlantic slave trade. That doesn't justify the Atlantic slave trade. It's just important to have that perspective.
Throughout the 13th century, more than 1,000 slaves left the Mali Empire every year. They were joined by contingents from Kanem-Bornu, Ethiopia, and Nubia.
All of the roots in that period really are focusing on the Islamic world. And so the roots come from from the peripheries, and they go into the centers. And very often along these routes that brought slaves into the Islamic world, you see slaves going actually in both directions as well. They tend to go in greater numbers toward the center of the Islamic world, but people are bought and sold everywhere along the way, so that slavery itself is everywhere.
We don't have precise figures. There are no statistics and no systematic studies. But it seems that many more people died and disappeared during the crossing of the desert than of the sea. According to some hypotheses, and some contingents, it was 30%. So 1 in 3 of those slaves being transported never made it to the other side.
The Attar al-Nabi market in Cairo. It was at this fruit and vegetable market on the banks of the Nile that ships used to unload their goods. Today, no one remembers that thousands of captives arrived in Egypt at this location after a 4,500-kilometer trek through the desert.
This long period of slavery and its memory are a problem today because they've yet to be addressed by historians. So there's widespread misunderstanding and ignorance of history, and it seems this black presence is considered awkward. For example, the Maghreb region is called Northern Africa, but not Africa. We're told it's a white Africa, totally white, and that black Tunisians, Algerians, and Moroccans are strangers, although they've been here for centuries. In Tunisia, they have dreadful sayings like, "May God not blacken our wombs." In high school, I was taught this horrible poem in which black slaves are described as people born from the most appalling of all races.
Comme étant en effet des êtres issus des races les plus abominables. لا تشتري العبد إلا والعصا معه إن العبيد لأجناس مناكيد من علم الأسود المخسي مكرمة أأهله السود أم أذنه وهو في يد النخاس دامية.
This left a lifelong mark on me.
And so it's important to pause and think that our species existed for 200,000 years, and the human existence model was cooperation, egalitarianism, working with each other. There were no possessions, there were no property, no power, no wealth for 200,000 years. Then we get to a point where we are brutally enslaving people, killing off 1/3 of them in the process as we move them away from their homes and their families to go and work in gold mines and salt mines and that kind of thing. How did we get from this point to that point? And as I'm suggesting, it was agriculture and animal husbandry that changed that human existence model, and it's important to recognize that and what the implications are for today. Let me get you to, let's take another look at Timbuktu. Let me stop that share. I got to get to the right one. This is the one.
Timbuktu became one of the principal cities of a rising new power in West Africa, the Empire of Mali. Mali was founded around the year 1240 by a legendary warrior king called Sanjata, who grew his small provincial kingdom into the largest state that has ever existed in West Africa. When King Sanjata assembled his army, he ordered his local chiefs to surrender their titles. Such was the reverence accorded to the king that his subjects were said to approach him on their knees. Mali would become a great empire with political, military, and religious power concentrated in the figure of the emperor.
The Empire of Mali takes the mantle from the Empire of Ghana insofar as it comes to control the gold trade from West Africa, but it doesn't just take over, it expands. So this is the time when the gold trade really reaches its height and when the kind of wealth and opulence of the West African imperial states are greatest.
Through its control of the gold trade, Mali became a superpower of the medieval world. But gold was just one of its products, exchanged through a complex commercial network that traversed the desert.
Even though the Sahara Desert looks empty, it's actually, they've got trading communities located within the desert, and there are stages of trade that go back and forth.
When we talk about the trans-Saharan trade, it gives the sense or the impression that goods were transiting through the Sahara to get to markets to the north. But there's a sense in which the Sahara was a world in its own, and a very integrated world.
One of the most valuable items in the trade originated within the desert itself: salt.
Salt is the refrigeration of the ancient world, right? So that you can't, have meat or fish or any kind of, protein products last more than a couple of days unless you salt them and smoke them. Salt is almost impossible to find in sub-Saharan West Africa, except when people are making sea salt.
In the Sahara, salt was mined, and mined in forms that were like slabs. It could be carried for hundreds of miles on the back of camels.
Another commonly traded commodity made salt mining even more profitable: slaves. Slaves were captured as a result of military action, such as war or sometimes raids, then sold to Berber traders.
There were some slaves that were incorporated in the trans-Saharan trade in the early period. There's actually not just an export of trade of slaves from sub-Saharan Africa in small numbers, but there's also an import of slaves into sub-Saharan Africa from North Africa and Europe, also in small numbers.
They would settle the slaves around oases to grow cereals and other crops. Slaves also worked in gold mines. Much of the surplus that went into long-distance trade was actually production based on slavery.
It wasn't only commodities like gold, salt, or slaves that moved across the desert. Traders also carried with them treasured personal possessions.
Okay. Now I need to take a minute as I change to this next desk. It's important to make sure I get the right one up here. Come on now. Okay, hang on. I want you to, there you go. Now, be able to get out of that. Let me get to this one. Takes a second for this to load in. Okay, I have that. Now, let's share this. And oh, I'm sorry, the wrong one. So that should be slave trading. Back to that again. Should be survivors. African gold.
We are survivors is our story.
Let me get that right. Come on now. What did you just do here? Okay.
1352, the Sahara, the largest desert on the planet. A searing wilderness, the size of the United States. The toughest challenge an explorer can face. Ibn Battuta. He left Morocco at age 21, vowing never to travel the same road twice. He's explored over 40 countries, but this is his first time in the Sahara.
We set off into a desert totally devoid of settlements. There's no road, no track, only sand.
But at this time, the Sahara holds the key to mankind's survival. The plague rages through Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. It's killed up to 1/5 of the world's population. In Damascus, Syria, Ibn Battuta records 2,400 deaths in a single day. But the Sahara is a barrier against the pandemic. With temperatures up to 135 degrees, the plague can't survive the heat of the desert. Few living things can.
The Sahara is vast. It's the definition of a horrible place to be. There's no water, it's incredibly hot. Your eyes are playing tricks on you. Your mind starts playing tricks on you. It's an incredible ordeal.
The body's cooling system shuts down. Heat stroke.
Then you stop sweating because you have no ability to get rid of fluid to allow you to cool down. You stop thinking normally. And it's that erratic, bizarre behavior that ultimately leads to death.
Ibn Battuta's life in the hands of his traveling companions, the Tuareg. Nomads from North Africa. They've lived in the Sahara for over 1,000 years, trading something we take for granted today, but was once one of the most valuable commodities on the planet. Salt.
Salt was everything. Salt was literally the difference between life and death.
Before refrigeration, salt was the key to preserving food. It absorbs water and stops bacteria from growing. Salted food can last for a year without spoiling.
Access to salt determined but they were powerful enough. I can't send an army across the water or great distances without provisions, and their provisions are going to go bad if they are not salted.
The Tuareg have discovered a rich supply under their feet. Millions of years ago, the Sahara was a sea. As the water evaporated, it left behind huge salt deposits. The salt trade is the Tuareg's livelihood. They mine it at Tekhaza in the middle of the Sahara, then trek hundreds of miles south to the markets in the great cities of the Mali Empire, Djenné, Gao, and Timbuktu. But it is a dangerous journey in a deadly landscape. The greatest fear of every traveler, a sandstorm. Whipped up in seconds by 70-mile-per-hour winds.
When a sandstorm hits, it fills the air with sand, it fills your lungs, it fills your eyes and your nose. You can't see. This wind and this sand can strip the paint off a car. You have to get shelter or you die.
One of our party was lost in the desert. After that, I never went ahead or never lagged behind again.
After 2 months in the Sahara, Ibn Battuta's camel train reaches its destination, the cities of Mali.
Travelers have nothing to fear. They gave me gifts of food and treated me with the utmost generosity. May God reward them for their kindness.
Tuareg merchants can now trade their precious cargo. In Mali, salt is so in demand, it's traded for gold. Today, most gold in the world has to be mined deep underground. In Mali, it flows out of the bedrock of the river Niger. At this time, as much as 2/3 of the world's known gold reserves are in West Africa. The key that turns Mali's rulers into some of the richest men in the world, and their cities into centers of learning. Timbuktu University, one of the oldest in the world. The first in sub-Saharan Africa, up to 25,000 people, a quarter of the population, students. Over 300,000 scrolls. one of the greatest libraries in the Islamic world.
Scholars from lots and lots of places went there to study the scroll. It was the World Wide Web. It was the place where information was held.
This is Africa's golden age. In the south, great Zimbabwe, a gleaming city of stone, legendary site of King Solomon's mines. In the highlands of Ethiopia, an ancient Christian empire claiming to descend from the Queen of Sheba. And on the east coast, Kilwa, one of Africa's busiest ports.
Okay, and now let me get back to here. Get root menu. Title menu. Okay, it's not going to cooperate here. So I will have to reload it. And understand within Africa, it's a constant search for more slaves, and we have more warfare. We have razzias, which is slave raiding.
Ndongo, Central Africa. Today, part of northern Angola. In a struggle for resources that shapes the world we live in today, one woman fights to keep hold of her kingdom. Queen Nzinga Umbandi. Skillful strategist, warrior queen.
Hey, Ndakuna.
Nzinga was a ferocious woman who was a ruler, but she was very complicated.
Queen Nzinga confronts a formidable enemy, the Portuguese. They want her territory and her people as slaves. Portuguese plantations in the New World need a workforce to produce a new crop changing mankind's taste: sugar. Humans are drawn to sweetness more than any other flavor. Today, we eat up to half our body weight in sugar every year. In the Americas and Caribbean, the Spanish and Portuguese lay out vast new plantations of sugarcane.
People have always wanted luxurious food that tastes good. And the hunt for luxuries has driven the exploration of the world and the spread of trade networks.
Agriculture on a new industrial scale, driving the demand for labor and a new commodity: human beings. Like many African rulers, Queen Nzinga has been selling captives and prisoners of war to the Portuguese.
The African slave trade was a conspiracy, unfortunately, between avaricious Europeans and African elites. Nzinga was a slave trader herself, like many of the monarchs in Africa at that time. But she sold slaves, other Africans, captives in war, to defend herself against the encroachment of the Portuguese.
But as the sugar trade expands, so does the demand for more African slaves. Her former trading partners have turned against her. They now want her people as slaves. In a mountain stronghold, she prepares to defend her kingdom and her people. Against her, not just the Portuguese, but their new African allies.
She was up against warlords who were taking advantage of a market for people. They were human traffickers, and they were armed.
Hey, hey, hey.
With Queen Nzinga, her sisters, Princesses Mukambu and Kafunji.
Hey, hey.
Yes.
Hey, hey. Zaku. Zaku. Kindila. Kindila.
Are outnumbered, surrounded. Princesses Mukambu and Kafunji enslaved. Over 3 centuries, European slave traders will transport 15 million Africans to the New World. The majority from Central Africa.
It's one of the most horrendous and painful moments in modern human history, both for Europeans and for Black Africans.
One of the things I think is important to understand is that I wanted to show you this from the perspectives of different documentary film producers, and you're hearing the same, story again and again, and from adding different facts and that kind of thing. But it's also important to see that over time, it's escalating. It's not getting less. It's not there's nothing changed. There is a system that has emerged, an economic system for creating enormous wealth and power, and fueled by greed. And so since nothing is going to change it, it's important to see that what's going to happen then is it's going to become more entrenched. It's going to continue to expand. It's not going to go away. And if you look at some of our contemporary events, you can think, well, maybe, yes, we've had this bad incident, but maybe it'll get better.
Much of my life, it turned out.
And so you can think, well, if there's something occurring and it's making people a lot of money, it's become systemic. It is now throughout the continent, and there's nothing that is going to slow it down, and it is expanding. You can expect, and when you look ahead, that things, how bad they are today, they're going to be much worse tomorrow. And so I want to open the door to the Atlantic slave trade.
already. Africa. Sierra Leone was once a major hub for the slave trade. More than 300,000 people were taken from here and shipped to the New World in bondage. But the first slave traders in this place weren't Europeans. They were other black Africans. Africans practiced slavery long before they ever saw a white person. All across this continent, slaves were part of a system based not on race, but on ethnic difference and brute power. A system involving an enormous array of monarchs, merchants, and mercenaries.
African kingdoms were at war with one another. War was a theme in Africa and actually Europe as well for many, many years. And so as a part of these wars, as a result of these wars, people were taken hostage and made into slaves.
I've come to Port Loko, a river town in Sierra Leone, and the long-standing home of the Temne people. For centuries, the Temne here collected captives who had been taken in wars. They tied them, packed them into small boats, and sailed them downstream, where they were sold to Europeans for profit. We sometimes romanticize Africa. We think that Africa was idyllic until the white man came. But there were deep tensions between ethnic groups here. Black Africans didn't necessarily feel the bonds of skin color any more strongly than, say, white Europeans did.
Slavery was ongoing before the Europeans came. It was just a common business. They come here in this wharf. Here is the landing part for the boats.
Who were the slave traders?
The slave traders were great warriors, strong men, chiefs. They do this business.
A lot of misery loaded on these boats.
Yes, but our people, we are not thinking about misery. It was a lucrative business.
Mm-hmm. Assalamu alaikum.
Professor Gates.
I was surprised to find out that in Port Loko today, there are still many families whose ancestors profited from the trade. And some of them were willing to tell me about it. Good. Just speak from your heart. Did any of you receive wealth inherited from the slave trade?
More fee, not an 500 slaves.
500?
500.
My God, so he was very rich.
Yes, yes, our people we are rich. Until the road account of Karam then people saw ban or ante a cotegui and apagua a room bomiowi.
Would chiefs wage war just to get slaves?
Oh, yes.
I'm a takan kalantaka a pinkar, mabir, mabang, ka ambayang. Tala prata fino o me fino car.
In America, we think black men were selling black people to the white man. But when you see it, do you see it as Temne were buying Loko, Mende were buying Temne, etc.? Is there a difference?
Well,
were all black people black?
Only BB.
It's true that black people are black.
So for certain team,
we don't speak the same language.
Saba lingati.
I don't like what you like.
Mas for certain skin is a pueblo man.
You know, we don't just live in harmony.
Though some find it difficult to face, the crucial role of Africans in the slave trade is now well documented. Historians estimate that the overwhelming majority of the slaves shipped to the New World were captured and sold by African kingdoms. But Africans did not invent slavery. It existed everywhere, dating back to the most ancient civilizations. Nor did Africans envision slavery as something that would be passed on from one generation to the next. something based exclusively on race. That was a European innovation.
Europeans had actually developed an idea over several centuries that they should not enslave each other. They could kill each other, torture each other, fight each other in wars. But Europeans did not enslave other Europeans because Christians did not enslave other Christians. The great advantage of Africans is that they were outside the European community. And so it was possible to use race as a way of providing a marker of who's enslavable and who's not.
Sailing in ships of radical new design, armed with new weapons and new technologies, Europeans transformed slavery into a business far larger and far crueler than anything the Africans had ever done. Of course, it didn't happen overnight. The dehumanization of an entire race was a process requiring many steps. One occurred here. This beautiful island, shrouded in fog, is home to what was once a fortress built by the British in the 1670s.
Out there is the mouth of the Putloko Creek. African middlemen used to bring their slaves and goods down the Putloko Creek, through the mouth of the Putloko Creek out there, all the way to this beach here.
So they came right through that gap,
Yes, sir. Yes.
They would bring them here, then march them straight up there and sell them.
Up this hill, up onto the trading area.
Though its walls have long crumbled, I could still get a sense of how this place once worked.
This was the main entrance into the fort. It had a double folding door with a little room patch on top.
British officers lived here in a lavish two-story mansion.
That's a fireplace, a fake fireplace, because there is no flue. This is the tropics. You don't need a fire in the tropics. But it was an attempt by the slave traders that lived here at elegance.
A little touch of home.
A little touch of home.
How many men? The British enjoyed parties here, even a small golf course. Slaves, meanwhile, were herded like cattle.
In here is the women's and children's slave yard.
Okay, they were herded like cattle, because what I'm suggesting is that the model that became animal husbandry then got applied to humans. And I'm going to talk, when I send out the summary, I'm going to talk about the different models that emerge as slavery kind of morphs in the African slave trade, but it will morph once again with the Atlantic slave trade and become ever more draconian. Okay, with that, Lauren, we can open up for discussion.
Okay, I'm gonna, so what we would like people to do is raise their hands. I don't know if Margarita wants to ask her question. Everybody probably wants to go to gallery view as well.
Margita had posted a question about when was the first large enslavement of people, and is, to the best of my knowledge, historians don't know. We don't have that documented. We don't have documented when the first people were enslaved. So it's it's unknown. I think it is important, however, that we look at that transitions from hunter-gatherer to civilization. And there are people who, they come from empires. Their homeland was an empire at one time. And they, we talk about Africa and the colonization of Africa and the horrible behaviors and things that were done to colonists. And they will often say, well, but we did bring them civilization. and as if civilization was something quite good, and civilization transformed humans from a cooperative basis of society, no possessions, no political ideology, none of that. We were all in it together, and civilization transformed us into greed.
It was also interesting that they did this based on considering each other other, which is a tactic that is used today extensively.
Yeah, and you can see, I wanted you to hear the African academics talk about how racialization emerged within the continent. But then when the Europeans enter in the Atlantic slave trade, they rationalize and justify what they're doing to say, oh, well, we're not enslaving Europeans, we're enslaving the other, the Black, people different color than us. So, and that somehow makes it okay. So it's important to see that process of rationalization and justification.
Tom, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Sal, a quick one. You mentioned that a lot of them were based on religion, that in terms of why Europeans did not consider enslaving other Europeans because of religious reasons. How do you feel? And of course, I'm being, I guess, looking way forward, I guess. But how would you compare that now then to how politics would play to it into a situation?
Well, I think it's important to understand that what happened, as I talked before about the emergence of religions, that they emerge as blowback to the people of power and wealth, and in that process, they want to convert people who believed in the pagan gods to believing in monotheism. And so as they're kind of going through that struggle and they're being co-opted by the people of power and wealth, it's kind of the middle ground is religion will not pressure those of power and wealth if those of power and wealth will agree not to enslave those who have converted to the belief in monotheism. So you kind of get that kind of trade-off going on, and the religion then defines areas as being no slaving zones because they had converted the peoples in those areas to belief in monotheism. But so what you get is religion is really a political organization. And it is fighting for a belief in how, societies should be organized, what should be the rules, all of that. I think it's important to look at religious institutions as a political entity. And they will be and they're, if I go to the time of Abraham and the moral code that he brings with it, and further refined by Moses, and then refined again by Jesus, and refined again by Muhammad, the religious institutions are really calling for treat each other well, don't stop killing each other and all of that kind of thing. But those institutions become co-opted and become a platform for slave raiding. So here is I can take it becomes, is the religion really following the doctrines that its adherents say that it believes, that its texts call for, or is religion simply a platform for another political entity or a business enterprise entity? So here you have, Islam, and, the Quran has loads of things about, how you're supposed to treat a slave, and it's better off not having someone as a slave. And it's really not supportive of slavery, but it recognizes it's there, and it's not saying it's got to be condemned, but it's not really endorsing it. Yet it becomes the people who are the followers become the main logistics transportation of slaves and goods. So, and we're going to look in a couple of weeks at Christians going into the West Indies, and they are going to claim Protestant supremacy, meaning under our now religious belief, we're going to toss off all rules against how you treat slaves, and we're going to create the darkest slave codes ever known. So, it's, I don't know what name you give it, but religion becomes co-opted, and the institution is something other than what the faith espouses. I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but it's the best one I got.
Do you have something, Graham?
Yeah, I was just wondering a little bit about, was it the proliferation of the Europeans and then their acceptance of the slave trade and bringing them in that caused the shift over from salt as a currency to sugar as a currency? And when did that really happen?
Well, next week, we're going to talk about what emerges. The Europeans become more involved in the African slave trade, and they come up with this new business model of a plantation. And they want to try it out on the African continent, but the Africans say, no way, you're not allowed in here. So they try it out on the islands. And so they come up with this new model, and it looks like this can make a fortune of money. So and that coincides, just happens to converge with new technology that's going to open up the oceans. And so they're going to bring that new technology to the West Indies, and they're also going to say, well, we need a lot of people to work these things, which is going to be sugar. Begins as sugar in the Caribbean, and of course expands into cotton, and cotton is also in demand at this time. So, I mean, before the Atlantic slave trade. So the idea of a plantation where you can grow a lot of cotton is also on their mind. So yeah, it's the commodity was salt at one point, and then it starts morphing into other things. And what you see is the heart of getting wealthy is to take control over a commodity, find a place where you can manufacture it, and have humans be the machinery to extract it. And while this is happening, we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade, the African slave trade, and then it expands into the Atlantic slave trade. At the same time, the banks of London, the insurance companies of London, finance companies of London have picked up on this, and they're providing the financing. So we have a few at the very top of African societies who are getting wealthy. The rest of the population is not. But London is getting enormous capital as a result.
Enormous capital.
The triangle, and then the triangle trade emerges. But mind you, we don't have the name capitalism yet, but that's what it emerges into. And let me quickly add, I'm not anti-capitalism. Capitalism is just an economic system. It's what you do with it that it makes it good or evil. Yeah.
I thought it was also interesting that it's sort of unrelated to the slavery, but we always hear about the library at Alexandria, and I never knew about all these things that, you know, the wealth of information in Mali. It's been, I'm not going to say it's been ignored, just hasn't been reported on in the same way. And I don't know if that's because Mali is more sub-Saharan, and so that also plays into this racial bias or what?
Well, much of African history is buried, just like Native American history has been buried. We're just now learning a lot about this stuff. I mean,
It's true. There were only a couple thousand Native Americans here, as far as I know.
Right. I can recall one person making a vehement argument as to why Africans were not black people were not the equal of white people. Look, they've never created any art. They've never created any science. They're not, you know, of course, because all of that is not, you know, if you don't recognize what was there and you don't, you know, teach it or tell anybody about it, well, of course, it's easy to say, you know, they haven't done anything. Well, it's like Rick Santorum talking about Native Americans. Well, they didn't really do anything. That's because he's utterly ignorant of what they did. He doesn't know that they were here for 20,000 years. He doesn't know that they had the first democracy in America.
He doesn't know
so
they have anything.
Here is a guy who is a US senator running for president, utterly ignorant about the people who occupied these lands for 20,000 years. And of course, there's a reason he's ignorant, because America wants ignorant people. We are passing laws today to say this class should be outlawed.
That's right.
There's a reason you want to keep them ignorant.
For sure.
Some Republicans.
Carol, do you have a question or a comment?
Have a comment. When war was
nice
getting
now, Carol. Be nice now, Carol. Don't.
when war was getting close to Timbuktu, I don't know if it's still going on, but a few years ago, the people in Timbuktu began to move all of those manuscripts, and they even snuck them out. And I don't know especially how they did it, but they were really concerned that all these manuscripts would be destroyed by these people that were coming in. And I don't know who they were, but you know, one of these groups that's over in Africa that's always fighting, and it's close to Nigeria, and they have a lot of some there, and they might have been getting close to Timbuktu. So there's still a lot there, but they have been trying to digitize it. And of course, the big problem is money. That kind of thing is expensive to do.
Well, the Mali Empire was huge and powerful and rich and should be as well known as the Roman Empire or the British Empire. France colonized Mali. And, you know, it has, what you've had is the business model for working with countries in Africa is for Western corporations to come in and say, we want your oil, your gold, your whatever you got, your lithium for our batteries, your stuff for our microchips. And what you do is you make the head of state, the power of government, have lots of money. You make sure that they become very wealthy. And you keep the rest of the population down. They are, because you want them poor, because you want them to have to work the horrible jobs of going into mines to extract the things that are needed to make cell phones. So, and cheap, if you want it done cheap. So, there have been movements to try to fight back against this power structure and to, for the base of the population to get a cut of more of the action. And so they talked about Al-Qaeda was starting up in Mali. One of the groups referenced during the videos we looked at was the Tuareg. The Tuareg, who have been trading along through the Sahara for thousands of years, were one of the leaders in fighting that. And I don't think the Tuareg was going to take a second seat to Al-Qaeda. but that's what it just was. Oh, well, it's Al-Qaeda. It's not Al-Qaeda. It's an indigenous force that's fighting back against the power. And it rattled a lot of Western powers. In fact, France sent troops in. Because even though France is no longer the colonial emperor, they still have a lot of business interests there, which can be more cancerous than the country being a colonial power. So it's, I just think when we start looking at these things more deeply, what you get is there's something that is making the human condition miserable. And I look at that as a cancer that will eventually one day erupt. And then we'll all be surprised. It's like 9/11. Where did that come from? Well, you'd only be surprised if you didn't know anything about the history of Iraq and Iran and the Middle East. It was, why did it take so long? I mean, really, they've been, subject to the oil companies for so long, and really, it's for people living in a country where they don't feel that they really have an active part in it. They're just simply subjects. Don't be surprised when they rebel. Well, I want you to know, I think about, my kind of classes present a kind of not an uplifting sense of the world. But that's, I would prefer an uplifting sense of the world. I'd love to watch TV shows where rational stories are told. You get to the end and the good people have won and the bad people have all been shown the error of their ways and logic prevails and everybody is better off. But and it disappoints me when I come to look at the real world. I have to tell you, these studies, when I did this in my career stuff, it is looking in the abyss. It's not pleasant. But it is, I think, legitimate research, not on my part, on the part of the academics, which is why I like you to see the different ones and what they have to say, because it's very important and it's real information. I would really like to go back to the days of Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver and to believe that the world actually works that way. My life was a lot happier when I thought it did, but it doesn't. So anyway, with that, folks, we'll see you next week. And please.
Okay, let's clap.
Yeah.
Not clapping.
Okay.
Yay, thank you, Sal. Thank you, Sal. Thank you, Sal.
Good to see you, Gail.
Yeah, nice being seen. You as well. Take care. See you soon.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Bye.